Let me introduce the first panel, the four speakers in the first panel, focusing on Lacan's Lavidis. Emily Laurent-Monaghan, who is a PhD student at Newcastle University. Arsalan Reihanzadeh, who is a PhD, actually just submitted his PhD here at ZSA. Moritz, Herrmann, who is also a PhD student at Newcastle University, and Lavidis, who is a PhD student at the University of Ljubljana.
Though we are in a sad state of affairs with regards to many concepts of philosophy, I believe we might be in the saddest when it comes to its most basic concept, namely that of the axiom. On the whole, the term axiom receives only the vague meaning of a self-evident yet unprovable principle or proposition. In the meantime, in the discourse, let's say, of mathematics, the term carried for a long enough time this effectively philosophical meaning, or rather, this ambiguity characteristic of metaphysics, in a rare overdetermination of the mathematical discourse by the philosophical one. And above all, in psychoanalysis, we throw around the term axiom as though it refers to anything put in the form of a statement. Though Lacan discusses axioms somewhat at length in his seminar and tends toward precision there, he hardly ever bothers with the term in his écrit, and when he does, it is loosely and to refer to principles or propositions that qualify only dubiously as axioms. For example, the definition of a signifier. Nonetheless, Lavidis, chiefly among the écrits, to the extent of offering the most extensive synthetic Vorstellung of Lacan's system, is all about the axiom, almost every page being devoted to a turn, forcibly only half said, around this issue. But if you were to ask me, there's no way around it. The issue of axiom not only settles a dispute between philosophy and mathematics on the nature of specifically truth, but also diagnoses a crutch, béquille, in hitherto existing philosophical accounts of Lacan. This amounts to an imbequility. Indeed, not unlike the stereotype of philosophical logic that all men are mortal, this crutch is the nowhereness, or l'ubiquité, of presupposing the intradiscursively self-evident yet unprovable status of its principles and propositions. The buck stops here. Henceforth, a signifier represents your stupidity and nothing else to another signifier. Now, what is the axiom? Let's try to delineate three meanings, only two of which are often or ever considered. In the first instance, it could be called what I call a received axiom. It is something that, on the basis of all the things out there or in here, is extrapolated from these things and moreover is just the same and demonstrable. For example, I cogitate on the world, I cogitate on and with my very own mind, and I think, well, it seems that in all cases A equals A is not A, the soul is immortal, all bodies are extended, and the usual pleasantries. This, one could say, is the modern philosophical meaning of axiom, in the sense that, barring terminological deviation as well as deviancy, it amounts to a self-evident yet unprovable principle. This is the case for Descartes, for whom the above are eternal truths, as much as for Hegel, for whom it's eternal rubbish. Next, it could be what I call a constructed axiom. It is something that, in order to entail this or that consequence, is not true or false until we stipulate that it is so, with or against our philosophical intuition. For example, it is not true in the abstract that two parallel lines not meet at a point, nor is it false, but equally we can decide the truth or falsity of this axiom. This, contrarily, is the modern mathematical meaning of axiom, in the sense that it is precisely in mathematics that an indemonstrable proposition is one that has no reason a priori, and certainly no reason a posteriori, for being decided for or against, at least outside of what a mathematician, discursively, wants as its consequence, for example, to model intuitive three-dimensional space. Let's stop and consider the antagonism between these two kinds of axioms. The problem with the philosophical axiom from the perspective of mathematics is that ultimately it is equivalent to a presupposition, and specifically we must presuppose the truth of an axiom without saying how or why. Or yet more specifically, it means that we must leave the axioms to God, as Descartes makes abundantly clear, thereby smuggling in a covert methodological theology whenever we say that an axiom simply is what it is. This means that whatever does not seem to conform to our already preconceived opinion is unthinkable, and stipulation against this opinion heretical. And thus, from a mathematical perspective, the philosophical axiom is untenable. In the meantime, the problem with a mathematical axiom from the perspective of philosophy is that precisely there's no reason to stipulate it true or false, and thus the entire mathematical field is doomed to serving no purpose. This is already Kant's quibble with Leibniz's systematicians. If one simply constructs, then either one is doing so without reference to any of the stuff out there or in here, or, worse, one is constructing what is received, thereby committing petitio principii in the high degree. Or worse, from a critical perspective of a different articulation, if God is not the great creator of axioms, then it must be I who decides my axioms, thereby granting myself an unthinkable yet conscious autonomy over what it is that I decide. Now, Lacan's resolution of this antagonism is ingenious. Superficial, but precisely to that extent, profound. In its utmost generality, an axiom is something that is axios, worthy, neither eternal in the philosophical sense nor arbitrary in the mathematical one, which amounts to the same thing, only differentiated by the respective agent of axiomatization. But Lacan specifies in what sense it is worthy. It is not simply worthy to the extent that it is presupposed as principle. It is what it is not because God or I have already said it. Rather, it is worthy precisely of saying. Not speaking, nor having already been said, but saying. Put very simply, it does not go without saying. That means that it is out of the question that it would go either without saying, in which case I would be some other species, not a human animal qua speaking being, or with saying, in which case simply I would be God. In this manner, an axiom is, for psychoanalysis, indeed self-evident and unprovable, but in a different sense. It is self-evident because it is, precisely to the extent that it is worthy of saying. It is unprovable because it can be inferred retrogressively, but not proven from what is said. Indeed, to the extent that one would say anything at all, hence that there is the unconscious, not going without saying is the case of a lot of things, even most of them, yet not all of these things are axioms. In all probability, none of them are, precisely because they do not go without having been already said, while an axiom, precisely, does not go without saying. And what certainly does not go without saying, forclusively, privatively, absolutely, is, for psychoanalysis, the Freudian thing qua what is said of or by truth. Indeed, this thing, the truth that speaks as I, is none other than the locus of the axiom, the true meaning of the truism that God is unconscious. Thus, a philosophical axiom is not wrong but empty, likewise, nor is a mathematical axiom wrong but simply blind. But together they yield a third meaning of axiom, the psychoanalytic one, namely, the pre-axiomatic decision to axiomatize. This intuition is not without a correlate in the discourse of mathematics itself, since at a certain point in time it was realized that in the absence of this pre-axiomatic decision to axiomatize, our received axioms and our way of formalizing thought thereby would potentially render specifically logic ineffective. And arguably, this intuition is latent in philosophy, but only a contrario, since its most manifest forms are those that search for a philosophy either without hypothetical, or worse, presupposed truth. But what is only realized in psychoanalysis is that if there is the unconscious, i.e. the accident of not only a human animal qua speaking being, hence an axiomatizing species, then there must be the actually existing decision common to these little upturned turtles. Indeed, neither oysters nor beavers, it would so seem, axiomatize. As for dolphins or Saturnians, we'll never know. Now, this third kind of axiom is the condition at minimum that there be anything to say, before considering what it is that one would say. Thus, in the beginning is not the logos, but precisely the fact of some logos existing, since it is not what is said, but simply the fact that one would say, which precisely remains forgotten behind the logos. Hence the first line of L'étourdi. The basic signification of this statement, which is not received or for that matter constructed, but precisely the condition at minimum of reading the text, let's say subjunctively, is the following. In order that there be an axiom, and there must be, since without that it would go without saying, and thus we wouldn't be human animals qua speaking beings, it follows that there must be the pre-axiomatic condition of axiomatization, which is forgotten behind whatever it is that is axiomatized. Why? Since precisely only an axiom to the extent that it is understood as a principle or proposition is said, not this pre-axiomatic saying. This sounds incredibly stupid, but so long as it's not properly and indeed precisely comprehended, the state of affairs is, not would, is, worse. Now, this decision has an aspect strictly peculiar to it. What is said can always be renewed by being made subject of a saying. Indeed, this happens all over the discourse of mathematics, per Lacan. But as for a fact qua act of saying, one precisely can't have already said it, since this would reduce its saying to what is said, yet, just the same, one would say it, subjunctively. For if the saying and the said were to collapse, if it were to go with saying, if one were to unforget and thus understand the saying, it would not fulfill the condition at minimum that there be anything to say. This amounts to saying that the pre-axiomatic decision to axiomatize is never spoken indicatively, in which case, again, I would be God, but nonetheless is written as such. A paradox more brutal than those of Epimenides and Russell, neither of which, for Lacan, are paradoxes except to the extent of embrouiller us, of creating a clusterfuck. But this subjunctivity would be purely hypothetical if the condition at minimum were not to have not only a form, but also a matter. The fact of saying, qua that one would say, or yet more precisely, the between the fact, not the form, and the content of saying, the sayings remaining forgotten behind the said, this is the basis of structure being the realist, even the real itself. It is none other than the fact that there is a count, the species-specific decision that yalla, there is of the one. As such, there is only one fundamental concept of psychoanalysis, of which the others are merely consequences. Der einzige Zug, the paradoxical yet actually existing concept of the count, the pre-axiomatic decision to axiomatize, the act or tat Sache. And I note the unconscious is thus precisely not a hypothesis, as was so for Freud, and it might or might not exist, but precisely a decision that means it must exist on the part precisely of those afflicted thereby, without having said it. The material form of the condition at minimum is thus der einzige Zug. It is only when it is articulated that it is yalla. Strictly speaking, the count, in its pure ex-sisting, is subjunctive, in the dual sense that it is matem, which, if not said, sits on the board like signs in the desert, and if spoken indicatively, it is laong, which, in and of itself, is pure bullshitting. By making der einzige Zug indicative, matem is not only compossible with, but literally is laong. The logical universal rendering of the saying, it's in all cases that the saying remains forgotten behind the said, and the grammatical existential rendering thereof, perhaps, there is the subjunctive fact of saying remaining forgotten behind the content. Both are simply the exposition of the paradox that result from trying to say it indicatively. Thus, propositional logic is just as much a failure with respect to matem as transformational grammar, both being misrecognitions of their very own attempts to indicatively say the subjunctive fact of saying. By contrast, the axiomatic system that supports psychoanalysis and that results from its grounding axiom is a revised logic that is neither transformational grammar nor propositional logic. This axiomatic system, call it Kantorian if you like, or la Cantorisation if you like, is neither Aristotelian nor Chomskyan, though it accounts for both ex negativo. Indeed, if grammar already measures the strengths and weaknesses of logics which are isolated from it, we will return to this, and conversely, because there's no meta-language such that logics can be made the crutch of grammar, this is not because grammar wins over logic, nor because we must simply leave language to its very own poesy, spoken but unsayable, but because writing is not a language, a letter is not a symbol, a count is not a thing. Hence, per Lacan, there is a discourse of mathematics, not a language thereof, except in the discourse of science. It is logic that invents a language supposedly of mathematics, yet isolated nonetheless from grammar, but only in service of the accumulation of knowledge, i.e., the discourse of science. In this sense, to bypass the dimension of the letter is thus not only to fail to scientifically model natural language, not only to fail to do ontology in its actual existence as ontogenesis, but also simply to leave the count and thus the accounting to God. Indeed, this is the presupposition of all science that doesn't include psychoanalysis. Lacan's topology, by contrast, is one in which the word slices, qua count, rather than one in which it is the stuff. In the beginning was the count, or the trait, whether d'esprit or du corps, has a fundamentally different status than in the beginning was the logos. It simply means that Ugg, the first Neanderthal idiot, got a bone stuck in his throat. Now, it would be easy to spend my entire time, if not more, on simply the intricacy of what a constructed axiom is and by what means one reconstructs these axioms by means of mathematical writing. But let it suffice to say that if mathematics pertains to psychoanalysis, then it is to the extent that it is the privilege of mathematics to affirm the existence of an entity, and specifically one that doesn't go without saying. Absolutely. Thus, unbeknownst to itself, it half says the psychoanalytic axiom that what is axiomatized doesn't go without the fact of axiomatization, i.e., it half says the saying. Why? Simply for this reason, that a constructed axiom, for example, there is a set with no elements, the axiom of the void set, always confirms or affirms its truth by the very act of saying it, since the void set does not pre-exist its axiom, but only to the extent that in itself it does not know anything of why it is true, taking it with a strong psychoanalytic sense. In this sense, the there exists of an axiom, or yet more precisely, that it is irreducibly a act or tat Sache of saying, remains forgotten behind what exists or is stipulated to exist. Let's use a specific and ultimately quite crucial example, namely the axiom of foundation. Everyone knows that Fregean logic reaches an impasse, at least on the level of discourse, with Russell's so-called paradox. A set of all sets that do not contain themselves both contains itself and doesn't. In order to remedy this problem, one invents the axiom of foundation, which stipulates that every set contains a subset with which it has no set in common, i.e. it has the void set as its product, which has as its direct consequence that no set contains itself. But one doesn't say directly that sets do not contain themselves. Why? Since for a quite profound reason, a constructed axiom stipulates the existence of an entity, in this context a count, and not the non-existence of that entity, even though one could simply not stipulate it. Thus, what is said in the axiom of foundation, or rather what doesn't go without saying there, is that every set contains a founding set or whatever, sure, but precisely why it was axiomatized historically on the level of the fact of saying remains forgotten behind it. This axiom of ZF is crucial for Lacan because precisely a signifier is a set that doesn't contain itself, a definition, yet a much better one, with which to begin than the usual formulae. The above established, it should be straightforward why, for Lacan, it is easy to render the half-said sensible in the discourse, not language, of mathematics, since, indeed, it is there that one feels the divergence of the saying and the said as well as, moreover, the inability to coordinate the two in one utterance. In this sense, Lacan disturbs another cliché of his very own, namely that the unconscious is structured like a language. How? Well, per Lacan, mathematics has no more of a language than the unconscious is one, since it only seems a language retrospectively from the position in analysis from which it is oriented in discourse. In the writing, not language, of mathematics, there's no why of the axiomatization. It's the pure axiomatized. Yet, nonetheless, it is in the discourse of mathematics, there's not simply the fact of saying, but precisely what is said, not going without it, that there is this condition at minimum, remaining forgotten behind it that there is some axiom or there is a count. Else we have the discourse, or I would even say the ideology of science. Thus, we have some idea of why we axiomatize a set's foundation, or yet more precisely, we are those who axiomatize it ontologically and thus ontogenetically. But it is in psychoanalysis that we can explicate not why as such, but how it is axiomatized. Through psychoanalysis, we know toward what axiomatization is directed, namely inhabiting language. In what sense? In that it is received at the origin, but precisely that it must be constructed axiomatically in the service of a stabilità, a stable yet suppletive pseudo-natural habitat. In the absence of what? You guessed it, a sexual relation. Now we get to the stuff for which everyone bought their tickets, yet in the face of which they are just as much étourdis, dissed, or stunned. First, consider that though one speaks of there's no sexual relation, just as one speaks of the signifier represents the subject for another signifier, as a principle or proposition that just one accepts if one is to be a Lacanian, it is of a completely different character. Though it remains a saying for Freud, i.e. not understood, nonetheless it can be inferred from everything said by the unconscious, albeit not proven. If it can be inferred, then it is not a constructed axiom, put very simply. Indeed, it can only really be such to the extent that it is received by psychoanalysis in the same way that the soul is immortal or all bodies are extended is received by philosophy. It is stipulated to the extent that though no one says it literally, everyone says it effectively. This isn't to say that it is true, but rather that there'd be no discourse of psychoanalysis if it were not for that it is self-evident yet unprovable in that discourse. Nonetheless, it must be stipulated in order to account for that discourse. By contrast, the definition of the signifier is not received by any discourse and is largely misrecognized prior to Lacan. Now, there's no sexual relation. It is a constructed axiom. I mean, you don't have to take my word for it. It should be clear that the received axioms of psychoanalysis, just like there's no other of the other, there's no meta-language, there's no truth about truth, and all of the other famous sound bites, those nya, that are not deniable but which no negation supports, this axiom doesn't qualify as a constructed axiom because precisely it doesn't affirm the existence of any entity as true, but precisely denies the existence of something. Absolutely. Thus, one must ask, in what is the absence of a sexual relation a result of our system of axioms? It is not in the same way as there's no set that contains itself as a consequence of the axiom of foundation, since precisely the statement is not received as worthy of saying, as proven by Frege. Must it not be, then, that the axiom results from our system of axioms only ex negativo? It is not as a logical consequence, but precisely as the assertion of something that is prohibited in our system of axioms, hence an illogical consequence, the meta-ontological axiom of psychoanalysis. Indeed, though everyone knows that matem is formalization at the impasse of formalization, on the whole nobody bothers to ask on the basis of which system of axioms, i.e. on the basis of which what is said, it would be that Lacan's matem results from the stipulation of some impasse. Specifically, the formulae of sexuation are not the axiomatic system of Lacan's, and to assume their character is elementary in Lacan's system misses the point entirely of formalization. Finally, and this is the most important point of all, it seems that there's no sexual relation is inferred from the shit one says in the same way that the one is not is inferred from the fact of saying shit. The absence of a sexual relation is the stipulation that accounts for problems with sex liaison, just as the one in existing as the count is the one that allows one to construct an axiomatized system and so forth. But this could not be further from the truth, that is, further from die Tatsache selbst. If one is a clinical psychoanalyst, it is plausible that one might be able to treat the absence of a sexual relation and its consequences in the formulae of sexuation as holding the place of the grounding axiom of psychoanalysis. Why? Well, because the absence of a sexual relation is what one must stipulate in order to ground psychoanalysis as a discourse, as I said. It is self-evident, unprovable within it, though indeed intuitive, without which it would not exist. But honestly, I doubt this. Since if one takes seriously the thesis that der einzige Zug is the only fundamental concept of psychoanalysis and that metapsychology is only supported by the axiomatic system of psychoanalysis, then I'm not sure one is able to be a practicing psychoanalyst without comprehending, at least intuitively, the above difference. Namely, a case is none other than a special case of the fact of saying, or, as Lacan frequently writes, c'est le cas de le dire. That's how it is, or literally, it's the case of saying it. Yet a case is precisely not a special case of the absence of a sexual relation. Indeed, the received axiom of psychoanalysis is extrapolated from the data, one could say, of the species as a whole. Put another way, one can see that it doesn't go without saying from one speaking being, but you wouldn't catch a whiff of the absence of a sexual relation if not for the state of human animals on the whole, and ultimately if not for the discourse of psychoanalysis emerging as its historically mediated consequence. In any case, what is certain is that it doesn't work to assume this rien if you are interested in any Vorstellung of Lacan's system, i.e. theoretical psychoanalysis. Why? Taking the absence of a sexual relation as the constitutive axiom of psychoanalysis amounts to precisely petitio principii in the high degree. You presuppose that there's no sexual relation when in fact the question is how or in what manner it is that there is none of it, and thus you have no idea of what it is that you are supposedly explaining. Not unlike how the mathematical axiom of infinity cannot account for the cosmological infinite as received by us in its brutality, or how Freud tries to explain the Oedipus complex by means of the myth of the primal father and the horde, yet by presupposing the Oedipus complex at the origin of this myth. And practically speaking, without all of the above, one risks confusing ab sens, there's no sexual relation, with the swelling of sens ab sex, the supposition, erroneously, that there's a sexual non-relation. Hence, mutatis mutandis.
But this has no rhyme or reason without accounting for the status of the phallus. In the reception of Lacan's theory, or rather logic, of sexuation, there lacks a theoretical consensus regarding the place of the organ. Indeed, even in the most favorable interpretations of Lacan, especially feminist appraisals, subtract the crucial dimension of the organ from any reading of the organon or tool. Apropos of accounting for the phallus, Lacanian psychoanalysis has generated both appraisal as well as substantial critique. On the one hand, we have feminist appraisals of Lacan in the work of Jacqueline Rose and Juliette Mitchell, translators and interpreters of Lacan's seminar on feminine sexuality, who argue that Lacanian psychoanalysis overcomes phallogocentrism by denaturalizing the phallus qua organ. On the other hand, we have what seems to be the opposite charge, that Lacanian psychoanalysis is, at bottom, phallogocentric with respect to the organ and the signifier, such that the theory relies too heavily on the phallus. The charge of phallogocentrism aimed at Lacanians has a Freudian prehistory, which Lacan alludes to in l'état dit, citing Freud's disciples of the 1930s, Karen Horney, Helen Deutsch, and Ernst Jones. He indicts them for promoting deuterophilicity, that is, of demoting the reference to the phallus by reducing it to a secondary phenomenon, and in some cases, breaching with the reference tout court. Jones' case is simpler in its reduction. He reduces the problem of female sexuality to the phallus. Thus, we are left with elaborations of the Freudian impasse rather than resolutions. In Jones' case, women are over-identified with the phallus, women have everything to do with the phallus. And in the case of Horney and Deutsch, women have nothing to do with the phallic function and are outside of it. Both are worse. While I cannot venture too deeply into the details of the prehistory nor the posterity of this charge of phallogocentrism, it is worth noting that this charge repeats diachronically, such that we have fresh iterations in the work of Luce Irigaray, Judith Butler, and most recently in Catherine Malabou's Plaisir effacé. We may assert preliminarily that the Lacanian response to the charge of phallogocentrism is to sever the phallus from its organic referent and to postulate the phallus as signifier and ultimately as function. This response generates a twofold problem. Ontogenetically, the position undermines the weight of the organ as organon, as the human animal's very own tool for working through our species-specific discordance. And furthermore, logically speaking, given the subtraction of the organ from the formula of sexuation, we cannot say anything about how the species comes to reproduce itself, despite itself. We cannot venture a response to the question, how does an indeterminate animal X reproduce itself diachronically and synchronically? Here, I will not defend Lacan against his feminist critics, but rather I will defend Lacan against Lacanians, and in particular, the logophilia of Lacanian orthodoxy as a foul logocentrism, which insists on discounting the dimension, the dimension, of the phallus qua organ over and against Lacan's own letter. And it is truly a matter of where the stress falls here. Yet it is by following the path set out by feminist critiques, which minimally register the organ-phallus relation, that we can approach the border of this discounted problematic. That said, the charge of foul logocentrism misses the mark insofar that it fails to register the fact that Lacan is foul logocentric, because the human animal is. This statement is not self-evident and generates a series of questions that Lacanians must answer. How do we account for sexual difference, that is, the petite différence, as Lacan puts it in oublié, in our logic of sexuation? How can we logically preserve the dimension of the phallus qua organ? And is it not the case that if we fail to do so, then we fail to comprehend how the species is specifically able to reproduce? In order to make the stakes of this problem clear, it is necessary to tease out two interdependent yet seemingly contradictory elements. Il n'y a pas de rapport sexuel. For the human animal, there is no sexual relation. And two, le rapport au sexe, that in spite of the absence of a sexual relation, human animals still have relations, that is, sex liaisons. Firstly, il n'y a pas de rapport sexuel announces an ontological disclosure, certainly, but in a quite specific sense. It is not that one cannot speak about the sexual relation, since it is precisely by making a statement of a relation that we continue as speaking beings, but rather that one cannot write it directly. Thus, if sex for the human animal does not have sense, that is, if it is only absent, an absence of sense, then this does not only preclude that we would at least try to make sense of it, but that we actually do. That is, we make sens absex of it. In particular, even though we cannot adequately represent sex through words or images, the attempt at doing so is a precondition for continuing to make love.
Or fuck.
By writing a love letter as a supplement to writing the sexual relation as an efficacious scientific formula like that of inertia, or even through psychoanalysis precisely by trying to formalize one's sex. All in all, this means that we cannot be content, if we are to do a science of psychoanalysis, simply by admitting the absence of a sexual relation as a condition of the human species, since it is precisely by some lateral means that we indeed continue to reproduce. Secondly, this means that in the dialectic of absent and sens absex, there must be a relation, precisely to sex, and indeed, this relation itself must be asexual, that is, not sexuated. This relation, as argued in L'étourdie, is the phallus, or rather the phallic function, by which our sex liaisons are mediated. Thus, the phallus, without which the couple does not go by itself, is not phallic, as Lacan has it, not non-phallic, but simply not sexuated. This is demonstrated by castration, as written in our text. The rapport to sex would not be distinct in each half, as supported by the very fact that the rapport distributes them. The phallus is thus not a priori masculine. If anything, it is neuter or even neutered, hence castration for the human animal. And even in French, it is indeed symptomatically feminized.
La bite, la queue, la verge.
Right, so there are three often defended positions that the above renders untenable. First, the chauvinistic reading, whereby everything is phallic, since precisely the phallus, though not woman, is not phallic. Two, the feminist reading, whereby woman is not phallic, and thus feminine sexuality as purely other to the phallic function is hypostasized, since again, the phallus is that without which no sex would be for the human animal. And three, the implicitly desexualizing philosophical reading, whereby sexual difference would be transubstantiated, and thus everyone would be sexuated phallic, not phallically, and thus fallaciously.
That's with a PH.
In order to unpack these claims, let us venture deeper into l'étourdie. Most Lacanians think that what characterizes the human species is the absence of a sexual relation, full stop. While this assertion is true, it remains incomplete. The absence of the sexual rapport is but one of three conditions, as the text makes explicit. Here I will take us through the remaining two. The human animal, given the absence of the sexual relation, has a vital necessity for its stable habitat, stabilità, that is, the semblance of the one qua universe of discourse. Furthermore, it is only given the prior condition of the reproduction of the human species, which Lacan claims, quote, has nothing to do with the which Lacanians claim, has nothing to do with the phallus as organ, is possible. This, in fact, is a pivotal question for Lacanian psychoanalysis and does not belong to a spurious naturalism. The three conditions are thus the following. Il n'y a pas de rapport sexuel, often cited as the sole condition, when it is only the received condition of the human animal, for whatever reason. 2, the stabilità qua semblance of the one world of discourse is the condition constructed by the human animal in order to reproduce itself. And 3, the phallus is a compromise between the absence of the sexual rapport and the semblance of the one, and thus the condition that literally must be subjoined to the other two. Everyone knows that the human animal in its particularity fails to conform to a stimulus-response model of behavior. And thus to achieve a natural habitat in which an Innenwelt would be both distinguished from and in harmony with an Umwelt. In l'étourdie, as much as in the rest of his work, Lacan makes this clear, going as far to claim that any recourse in psychology to these animal models is supported by theology to the extent that it presumes a natural teleology in the human animal, namely toward reproduction. Sorry, I lost my mic. In particular, there is no stimulus-response couple that would support the reproduction of human life, and thus in their natural habitat that would serve an unproblematic end. No psychology, including that of Pavlov or Uxkul, registers the state of affairs, and thus the latter remains a dire to the former, and it is Freud who says this dire by making a statement of the unconscious. Hence, for Lacan, psychology's dire, which remains forgotten behind its dit, is the unconscious, which is precisely, of course, what Freud says. Thus, Lacan recommends to the psychologist that he pay attention to the Umwelt, the human Welt, the broken Umwelt, literally, orthographically broken with a hyphen, that the human animal creates in lieu of a natural acoupling. But it is important to recognize that the neologism Umwelt itself meets all three conditions above mentioned, not simply the absence of a sexual relation. That the human Umwelt is broken into a human vaulting or a leap, which as such is not locatable in nature, that this broken Umwelt is nonetheless a supplementary habitat which permits that the human animal continue to vault or leap into the next generation. That what both breaks the Umwelt and makes it supplement, and thus the human species' survival possible is precisely a cut, namely the phallus qua phallic function and the logic of castration. Thus, the Umwelt on the page and elsewhere is constituted by the core of the logic that subtends it, namely the phallus. Now, how does the Umwelt work not only synchronically but also diachronically, that is, over the course of the development of the species? The paradox is the following. On the one hand, psychology does not take into account the absence of a sexual relation as manifest in the abundant problems of our sex liaison, but it can precisely, if too easily, account for how it is that we reproduce. Namely, Jack has the instinct to find his Jill, makes a baby, and so on and so forth. On the other hand, psychoanalysis certainly is founded on giving an account of the empirical manifestations of a sexual discordance in the human species, but it is hard-pressed, especially among Lacanians, to issue a response to the question of how, in spite of the absence of a sexual relation, the human animal reproduces. Hence, just as psychology had a dire, namely the statement of the unconscious made ultimately by Freud, so does psychoanalysis, or at least psychoanalytic discourse after Freud, have a dire, namely that the compromise between the Umwelt as broken and nonetheless as supplementary does not go without saying, that is, without an account of the transcendental logic offered by the phallic function. On this point, Lacan is quite brutal with Freud. The latter does try to offer a response in extremis to the question of how the human animal reproduces, namely in Totem and Taboo, but his explanation for Lacan is inadequate. In particular, Freud saw what suppletes the absence of the sexual relation, namely the phallus in the paternal form for both Totem and Taboo, but did not see that it is a compromise between this stabilità and this absence, precisely because the absence remained a dire. In this sense, Freud recognizes the phallus as organ, but not as organon. That is, he would not have recognized it as a tool, given that he did not recognize that there was any species-specific problem to fix it with that tool, thereby giving us the Oedipus complex, but not its cause. Put another way, Freud observed the phallus in its capacity as a problem, namely as organ, but not in its capacity as a solution, namely as organon. Hence the mistake of considering the phallus unequivocally masculine, that is, of assuming that men have it and women don't, of assuming it is made of man rather than that it makes man, and indeed makes him work in the long run. On the other hand, we can equally be quite brutal with Lacanians. One reads in Lavidis that the human species does reproduce precisely by reproducing the question of how it reproduces. This means that the habitat is only created by labiating, de l'habiter, by making sense absex of absent through speech. And indeed, to the extent that speech is made possible by the phallus, it is palpable in Lacan how the organ is in fact an organon, which Freud again misrecognizes. In essence, to quote Lacan at length, and here I quote, "It is the organ is in fact an organon, which Freud again misrecognizes." It is starting from there that we obtain two universals, the two alls, two, that are sufficiently consistent enough to separate the speakings into what appears to be two halves, moitié, such that they are not too knotted up in their coitération when it happens to them, quand il arrive, literally when they come, end quote. Thus, in the absence of a received acoupling which functions empirically, there must be some constructed acoupling by means of the phallic function in order that reproduction precisely function, in order that the human animal co-iterate through coitus. Nonetheless, this means nothing if one sticks to the Lacanian crutch of phallus qua organon in a purely logical sense, that is, qua signifier. As Lacan has it, a signifier can serve many purposes just like an organ, but it is not the same. Which means both that the phallus signifier serves a different function from the phallus organ, as well as the phallus organ still has to function approximately in the way it should, otherwise we would not reproduce. Thus, the organ is not simply decreated qua signifier, it is isolated from corporeal reality, yet only takes on a signifying value, a function qua manner of functioning by virtue of its detachability, and thus it must be considered just as much in this sense. All in all, the above is contained in the following sentence. Here I quote, "The body of speakings, parlant, is subject to be divided by its organs, enough in order to find a function for them," end quote. That is, the body of any given human animal is divided by its organs in finding a function for them, at the same time as the body of human animals is as such divided by the organon in two universals, that is, by finding a function. All the above points are knotted together, but not too much, in this issue, underestimated if not uncommented upon in the literature of the so-called sex ratio. My basic line of thought is the following. It is taken for granted that, so long as we are not talking about empirical sex, but about the transcendental logic of sexuation, the sex ratio is purely a semblance of the sexual relation. Nonetheless, the brute fact of the matter is that the brute fact of the matter is that if there were not more or less an equal number of Jacks and Jills, then the species would, however slowly, cease to reproduce. But in another turn of the screwed, there is no empirical guarantee whether or not there is any natural necessity, that is, the sex ratio, remain constant, apparently being subject to pure chance. Yet, in the final dialectical move, we can say that the transcendental logic of sexuation is the supplementary manner in which the human species distributes itself more or less evenly on the basis precisely of the divergence, though not disjunction, of empirical sex and transcendental sexuation. But how can the above be accounted for? Now, we will proceed carefully by way of these points. Were we to be any other species, then biunivocal correspondence in the empirical count would suffice to guarantee the reproduction of the species. Thus, empirical sex would suffice as well. This not being the case, we need, and indeed already have, a supplementary manner of counting, namely a transcendental count, that allows us to exercise our sexual judgment, that is, to allow Jack to find his Jill, and vice versa. This is how the human species is under the condition of the one. Nonetheless, because indeed there is no sexual relation, the transcendental count of one sex does not biunivocally correspond to that of the other. In particular, the transcendental count of woman exceeds that of man. Yet this is neither thanks to the fact that there are simply more women than men, since this would be an aspect of the empirical count, nor to the fact that woman is simply more than man, since precisely there is nobody beyond the phallus. Even men and no such, even transcendentally, but rather to the fact that, again, transcendentally, there is a brute necessity to count men and no such necessity to count women. Freud obviously has an account of how men and women come to be man and woman in Totem and Taboo. Nonetheless, Lacan not only diagnoses Freud's account, but also provides his very own solution, the second being just as, if not more, important to understanding why, for example, woman is pas toute. On the one hand, Lacan analyzes the primal fathers, all the women, as a manifest impossibility, both in the sense that henceforth none of the brothers is permitted all the women, and yet more importantly, in the sense that even the father's one, what would be the primal mother, is strictly impossible. Thus, Totem and Taboo marks a failure to recognize the necessity of a transcendental count, and thus of sexuation, and ultimately of the absence of the sexual relation. On the other hand, Lacan proposes a completely different solution. So long as there is a question about how the human species reproduces, then there is the question of paternity, namely, who really is my father? Precisely the question that reproduces itself, which until a certain point was not empirically verifiable. But even now that it is empirically verifiable, as Lacan remarks, quote, one isn't the son or daughter of this or that spermatozoon, end quote. Thus, there is a necessity to number patrilineage one by one from the perspective of a certain zero, which is or would not have been the primal father, yet which has no correlate in a primal mother. This is what gives the transcendental and not merely empirical count of men. By contrast, there is no need as such to ask, who really is my mother? And thus, in the transcendental count, women are not counted, or strictly speaking, countable. There is a discretion of men, but a continuity of women. Hence, without there having to be more women per man, there is not a mapping of one on the other. Hence, by reducing sexuation to sex, Freud tries to use the same yardstick, the same measure qua dimension for woman as for man. In Lacan's account, this takes on the literal meaning of measuring women according to the empirical count instead of the transcendental one. But this is precisely what a man does, if semblantly, when exercising his sexual judgment apropos of woman. Thus, Freud is not all wrong, but simply male-sexuated. Now, what is the symbolic function that permits, on the one hand, men to be numbered in the count, and on the other, women to retain a margin of independence from the count? Precisely the phallic function. Lacan, so to speak, puts the phallus in its proper double place as the bait, à pas, the hook, hameçon, and even the fish, poisson, that permits an organ signifier both as a jut, faner, and a trap, attrape, and thus as the cause of the transcendental count, to the extent that it would be differentiated from the empirical one. Thus, the transcendental logic of sexual...
But Emily, stop. A transcendental logic is unconceivable without a transcendental aesthetics. So, un peu de topologie vient maintenant. Given this inaugural statement of the third section of L'étourdi, it does not go without saying for Lacan that a bit of topology comes in. Moreover, it could easily be argued that it is topology which provides the entire text with its underlying structure, insofar as it can be considered as a series of statements or sets, with an S, that turns around Lacan's own saying within or for the sake of a future discourse of psychoanalysis. As every reader notices, due to the, even for Lacan's own standards, excessive number of puns and amphiboles, this doesn't go without some dazzling or stunning, étourdissement. But that at the same time, this dazzling turning around of the turns of saying, tour de dire, can be represented quite soberly through topology, and in particular, as I will argue, through the topology of the torus. Let us be clear. In L'étourdi and beyond, what Lacan means by topology is not a general philosophical logic or logos of space or places, topoi. According to such a topo logic, space could, for example, be globally defined in a Leibnizian fashion and thereby possibly even on mathematical grounds as the totality of relations among all punctiform places or situations. By contrast, in L'Étourdi and elsewhere, Lacan's reference is A, mathematical, and B, modern mathematical topology, as particularly applied to surfaces. Crucially, such form of topology is a form of formalized writing that subverts our very geometric understanding of what a point in space is, and by the same token of what kind of space a point is a point. Whether it is still a space of 3 dimensions, or rather a flatness, which for us is a no space, n'espace, in that it immanently negates or hollows out our intuitive 3-dimensional space. With respect to such a subversion of our geometric understanding of the traditional hierarchy of 3-dimensional space, 2-dimensional surfaces, 1-dimensional lines, and 0-dimensional points, my first claim with respect to L'Étourdi is quite straightforward. In this text, something, or even a saying, seems to remain forgotten behind what Lacan himself calls his, quote, recreation of mathematical topology, but is not entirely forgotten by him elsewhere, for example in Seminar 21. Such a saying, which remains forgotten behind what is said by Lacan here, is that of an axiomatic foundation of topology in so-called point-set topology. First of all, such an axiomatic foundation is not only possible in modern topology, but is even the common way of founding what Lacan does with topology in terms of a combinatorial topology. For in order to work, like he does elsewhere, like in Seminar 9, for example, with the vectorized rubber sheet, in terms of the combination of all the possible different vectors on that sheet, we implicitly need to assume those very axioms, for otherwise we wouldn't be able to identify the points on the opposite side of the rubber sheet so as to anticipate their gluing together in our intuitive 3-dimensional space. But then, what do these axioms say? What is a point according to axiomatized set theoretical topology? In point-set topology, which due to its foundational status is also called general topology, we start from an axiomatized set theoretical system such as Z of C in order to supplement it with at least 3 or 4 axioms, depending on the chosen variant. Those axioms then prescribe as to how to treat the elements of a given set as points contained within the topological subsets of that set. According to the most common axiomatic form, those subsets are primarily determined as neighborhoods. By a neighborhood of a point element is generally understood a set of points which are sufficiently close to that point so that we can localize this point without determining fixed quantified distances between it and any other point. Instead, any possible localization within a topological space is only implicitly carried out in that we axiomatically determine how different neighborhoods of a point relate to each other through unification and intersection, with the caveat that even the void set is to be considered as a neighborhood. Starting from there, we can then investigate the general properties of that topological space, which include compactness, continuity, connectedness, openness, and closure. More importantly, for our purpose and to simplify, whereas in geometry a point is absolutely defined by the distance between itself and any other point, in topology no point is defined as such in absolute terms. Instead, in topology, unless we are dealing with a special case of the metric topology, any possible point is equivalent to its neighborhoods and therefore equally equivalent to the points of its neighborhoods without any discrete measurement in between them. When we now turn to Lacan's beginning of the section on topology, we can thus say that Lacan himself abides by what Jean-Michel Vapereau calls the principle of abbreviation. He starts quite intuitively with the torus as if it were a given, in order to then progress to the other topological surfaces, the Möbius strip, the Klein bottle, and the crosscap. Only to then re-say what such a progression, and more specifically the cuts and sutures operated in between them, entails for both metapsychology and a theory of psychoanalytic experience. If this seems quite uncoupled from set theoretical topology, it is quite patent, though, that set theory does then return towards the end of the section on topology. There he approaches what the psychoanalytic concept of repetition means on the level of the torus in terms of the Cantorian transfinite and what he controversially calls the inaccessibility of the two. I simply claim that in order to make those very claims, which are quite heterodox for both set theoretical and topological standards, Lacan not only possibly but necessarily has to stipulate some axioms, and even the set theoretical axioms that underlie the topological axioms, in particular the axiom of the void set and the axiom of infinity. I will not be able to discuss this here or now, so let me just conclude on this by saying that if Lacan does not start his topology with topological axioms, at least he ends by half saying some of the set theoretical axioms beneath the topological axioms. Overall, I think we should distinguish between at least 4 different levels in Lacan's use of topology, which in their progression constitute a certain parcours from the saying qua writing of topology to the saying or re-saying of what this doing of writing says. First level. The foundational level or ground zero of an axiomatist writing in terms of what Paris called constructed axioms. Let this be the axiomatized system of Z of C and a supplementary set of axioms for a point set topology. Both on the level of writing those axioms as well as in deducing theorems from them, set theoretical topology is in no need of any image whatsoever. Second level. The combinatorial or algebraic use of the outcome of such an axiomatics, whether it be by writing vector fields on the surfaces or by determining their so-called fundamental groups. This is the first and an immediate sense of what Lacan himself refers to as topology's pure literal algebra, which, as he says, develops itself from one end to the other without any necessary recourse to any image whatsoever, even if the recourse to images on this level is already possible. Both the first and the second level for Lacan are instances of mathematical formalizations of impasses of formalization. Third level. The psychoanalytic recreation of this pure literal algebra by symbolically saying it. Such a recreation can abstain from a direct recourse to images, as Lacan does in L'étourdi and as I'm myself doing, and thereby economize on an always too metaphorical intuition, which has to be brought to silence in the very comment on topology, commentaire. Despite this, such a symbolic saying of topology inevitably provokes images in our intuition, fait image. If mathematics does not already contain an element of intuition on the level of axioms themselves, something which could be claimed, at least here it seems that it is the level where mathematics, quote unquote, extends into intuition. But especially by emphasizing how the writing of topology is to be specified in terms of cutting, gluing, and performing torsions that are not derivative but constitutive of those surfaces, such a controlled extension into intuition can provide us with certain intuitive evidences, but only insofar as these evidences, that which is évidemment as it is achieved by hollowing out by an évidemment of our intuition in a confrontation with a logical impossibility that is made sensible or touchable. Without going into any detailed operation of any particular évidemment, like that performed by Lacan and L'étourdi, showing how a Möbius strip is its own twisted cut, I think more broadly speaking we can say that topology renders evident or palpable 3 things. A, topology shows that, as Lacan has it during one of the talks he gave in the US in 1974, quote unquote, the letter is making holes, face trous, which, as Barbara Cassin rightly remarks, is equally making visually appear holes, face trous. B, starting from there, it becomes evident that topological surfaces are letters, or pure writtenness as an infinity of strokes or traits. This does not yet correspond to a matheme, or mathème, but instead to what Lacan refers to as the language of the pure mathème. And now we come to C, as a synthesis of the 2 previous points, topology renders sensible that those traits of a topological surface can or have to be considered as counts, but that there are counts which count nothing, which is in a way a pure cut, and counts which count some stuff by cutting out a topologically significant section. I will briefly come back to this, but this is quite obviously another privileged point of convergence between topology and set theory. Now, the 4th level. The discursive re-saying of what all the previous three levels not simply can say or teach us about metapsychology in the sense of being an adequate modeling thereof. Rather, such re-saying says much more directly in which sense those constructed axioms, level 1, the algebraic writing, level 2, and the cutting and gluing, level 3, correspond to the very matter or stuff, ethos, about which we speak and write about in our metapsychology and which we treat in psychoanalytic experience. In short, this level says what those topological operations are on an ontogenetic, structural, formal, and ontological level. And hence Lacan's underestimated or misunderstood claim that topology is structure, and even structure as the realist. This is also the level where the matem comes in as a different formalization of the impasses of those mathematical formalizations, one of which, even if it is a peculiar one, I will speak about in a second. From this, I think it can be seen that what Lacan calls the saying of his topology progressively descends into ever more fundamental or deeper and thereby thinner levels. It starts by operating a compression torsion on a torus, level 3, in order to then consider surfaces as being written algebraically, level 2, in order to eventually end up with a set theory of the Cantorian transfinite as itself absolutely requiring a certain axiomatic decision, level 1. As Paris showed, such retrograde movement is itself actually made possible by starting with even less than the ground zero of such a regression, namely with the distinction between the very fact of saying and the said, which equally amounts to the distinction between the pre-axiomatic decision to axiomatize and the axioms themselves. Now, my more particular claim concerning the section on topology is that Lacan accords a privilege to the torus precisely insofar as the torus can itself be a matem on condition that we make it be so. In this sense, A, the torus as such, as written letters, already mathematically formalizes an impossibility, which B, as such, conceptually corresponds to existence, which in turn C, is the relationship which any saying entertains with respect to what is said. If Lacan says that topology allows us to formulate, quote, a theme from which to situate the relationship between saying and said, I take the torus to be precisely this mathematical situation. Very roughly speaking, the fact of saying corresponds to the whole in the torus qua real, whereas everything that is possibly symbolically said corresponds to a specific trajectory or countable number of terms on the surface of the torus. But I think this general situation actually has to be understood psychoanalytically in at least three different senses or dimensions, according to whether we consider the torus 1, ontogenetically or constructively, 2, synchronically or structurally, and eventually 3, as being reconstructed in psychoanalytic experience. Before I briefly go through these psychoanalytic dimensions, let me say a few words on why the torus formalizes what conceptually corresponds to existence. On the one hand, we must say that on the intrinsic level of the torus itself, there does not exist any whole, properly speaking. The torus doesn't have any edges, and hence there are no gaps or holes in it. There is only a whole, improperly speaking, namely insofar as we consider it extrinsically as an object of our intuition. But on the other hand, the whole, nonetheless, is irreducible for the torus, insofar as what appears to be a metaphorical image of an unspecified emptiness is itself a property of the torus. For without the whole, the torus wouldn't be a torus. In this way, we can say that the whole is inexistent with respect to the surface of the torus, but that this inexistence is nonetheless necessary for the torus's existence. Hence, we can say that the whole exists to the torus. Now, the merit of an algebraic topological formalization is that it is able to take into account such an indirect property like that of the whole. It does so by determining what the so-called fundamental group of a torus is, namely by writing all the possible different ways in which a surface can be dissected or cut, and how those cuts differ in what they do with the surface under consideration. The fact that the torus has such a hole as well as a void space or emptiness in the tube is then accounted for by writing this fundamental group as an algebraic equation between its two elements. The one being the loop, which takes the tube itself, and the other element being the loop around the central hole. In short, the fundamental group as such says that we can only cut the torus into two pieces if we cut around both the central hole as well as around the inner void. This fundamental group then also corresponds to what Lacan calls the interior eight, which is in a specific sense equivalent to the mi-dit strip. From here, let me just briefly sketch the three dimensions I mentioned a moment ago. First, if we consider the torus ontogenetically, it does not yet situate the relationship between saying and said, since there is not any saying, properly speaking, which is the same as to say there is not yet an unconscious. Instead, through the ontogenetic torus is situated the very fact that there is saying, or the unconscious, insofar as it emerges out of the primal repression of a mistake or error in the count, seminar 9, which happens somewhere in the interval between the child's very first words and the end of the Oedipus complex qua castration. I claim that this interval, or what is said in it by the child, is best thought of in terms of the construction and even the time of the construction of the torus, which precisely requires an axiomatization. We could then say from premature birth to the end of the Oedipus complex, a child axiomatically constructs or lives the axiomatic construction of itself as a torus. And this very construction then corresponds to the child's entrance into the symbolic. By way of approximation, we can think of construction here in an Archimedean sense, whereby we continuously move a circle through space, which gives us a cylinder, only to then bend it back onto itself, which gives us the torus. Every pre-Oedipal demand of the child, which necessarily gets frustrated in one way or another, would thereby correspond to a circle, only that more properly speaking, a circle, as what Lacan calls unary traits, or sheer counts, is not as such discrete or closed, but in an infinitesimal deviation from itself, continues its rotation, i.e. is repeating itself, only to finally close onto itself or count itself. Only through this final closure of the continuously rotating circles at the end of the construction, which Lacan equates with the phallus or the master signifier, does the central whole come to exist. At the same time, the whole construction can be said to correspond to primal repression, or we could say to lie between the two extreme ends of primal repression, insofar as something does not get counted in the moment when the torus closes onto itself, namely the very turn around the torus. The whole. For Lacan, this corresponds to an original and inevitable error in the count, or an unaccounted -1, and the subject emerges not only out of the alienated vanishing beneath every repeated signifier of its demands, but out of the question whether the other actually has an answer to those very demands, and hence as real in the sense of an impossibility. But the subject only properly emerges when immediately it gives itself an answer to that question, and thereby is support in the fundamental fantasy by counting its own being nothing as one. Lacan thinks that this corresponds topologically to the cross cap as constructed out of the mi-dit strip, which in turn we have already received from the interior eight on the initial torus. So only to give you a very general and abstract idea of what castration would mean without me being able to go into the details here. I come then to the second level. Starting from there, that is to say after castration or separation has occurred, the torus corresponds to the diachronicity of the subject's self-conscious demands, as it is now backed up by the synchronicity of the unconscious. Not only is every signifier which a subject hears doubly inscribed, once as letter on the cross cap and once as signifier on the torus, the very speech of the subject is now conditioned by the fact that there is an unconscious desire which splits or a saying which exceeds the subject's spoken demands, i.e. there's always more said in what is spoken by the subject. The subject itself is now an affect of the said, effet de dit, insofar as its saying now is conditioned by the way in which it has organized, i.e. reduced to a phallic point in the cross cap, the void qua initial hole in the torus. Thus, even if the neurotic subject, for example, fills in the central hole by imagining there to be another torus, the other is another subject which lacks nothing, In a certain sense, the whole of the first torus, the very fact that the subject is the subject of the unconscious, is still present in the repetition of the symptom. Arsalan, do I have still some time? No? You think so? Okay. Finally, and progressing towards what I call an element of an transcendental aesthetics of psychoanalytic experience, I claim that in the very final section of L'étourdi, Lacan wishes to establish that the torus acquires a different status once you enter into analysis. Or even, we might say, the torus, again, only really becomes a torus once you enter into analysis, even if analysis is not reducible to the dialectics of the torus. Precisely insofar as repetition is now brought forth as a condition for a new separation. Interpretation as the form of saying proper to the discourse of the analyst then intervenes precisely upon this repetition. As Lacan comments elsewhere, in analysis, the analysand is first of all not defined by her saying, but by her speech. Whereas it is the analyst who is qualified through her saying, insofar as she maintains the discourse of the analyst, insofar as she maintains the discourse of the analyst, full stop. As such, interpretation is meant to function as a second dire, a saying which is itself stays in the background or remains forgotten behind what is said, but comes to aid in that it refers the analysand's speech to what is said in or despite that speech, thereby tentatively unforgetting its saying. Whereas free association encourages, we could say, a smoother inhabitation of the surface of the torus, connecting statements which otherwise would stand unconnected, but thereby remain incomplete in lack of any conclusive self-intersection, an interpretation isolates or cuts out something repetitively said in speech by making appear its own self-intersection through something said equivocally. In this sense, Lacan will claim that will have counted topologically as an analysand said a cut on the torus that not only intersects with itself due to an equivocity within the analysand's speech itself, but that this cut, in doing this, must inevitably pass by the central whole of the torus as the place from where to situate the saying of what has been said, thereby taking into account the equivocity of the unconscious itself. Against the otherwise inevitable forgetting of the fact that one says, behind what is said in what is heard, interpretation shall apophantically face par être, the fact of saying, which does not mean making saying appear or be, but letting it appear beside what is said in what is heard.
After its initial introduction in late 1971 in Seminar 19, Lacan further elaborated on the concept of mathème in L'étourdi, where he defined it as that which ensures the integral transmissibility of knowledge by adhering to the mathematical formalization. In both his 1994-95 seminar, Lacan Anti-Philosophy, and his 2010 debate with Barbara Cassin on L'étourdi, Alain Badiou underscores the critical significance of Lacan's key proposition, the absence of sense, absec sense. Particularly, he accentuates its importance in establishing the possibility of the mathème of integral transmission by positing that any function of the real in knowledge concerns, in positive terms, absence. In his seminar on Lacan, Badiou delves into two statements extracted from Lacan's Seminar 20, where he delineates a clear distinction between philosophy and psychoanalysis regarding the way they rearrange the relation between truth, knowledge, and the real. The first statement reads, "There is some relationship of being that cannot be known." The other articulates what Lacan identifies as the essence of analysis. Knowledge about truth can be constituted on the basis of its experience. The challenge of reconciling these two statements arises from the tension that Lacan presents. On one hand, he emphasizes the unknowability of some relationship of being, implying that truth remains elusive. On the other hand, he insists that analysis aims to constitute knowledge about truth or knowledge about the unknown. But you suggest that the key to resolving this tension lies in Lacan's concept of the meta. The meta serves to render thinkable simultaneously and through writing the fact that there is some relationship of being that cannot be known on the one hand, and on the other, that there is nevertheless knowledge about truth, i.e., that there can be knowledge about the unknown. This tension is to be reconciled by the analytic act as the passing of knowledge, as the knowledge that constitutes the truth of the discourse of psychoanalysis. It is the act that can be attested in the form of the transmissibility of knowledge, that is, the transmission of a knowledge functioning in the real, in the absence. Lacan himself emphasizes this point by stating that this is why the matem, on the basis of which the mathematizable, itself definable as what can be thought of, the real, is formulated in impasses, are likely to be coordinated with this absence from the real. For Badiou, this absence from the real implies the absence of the sexual relationship in any mathematization, which means it cannot be fully written. The matems as the key in the integral transmission of knowledge upon which the mathematizable is founded encounter an impasse in relation to this real. We have three components here: the real, the absence of the sexual relationship, the mathematizable as what can be thought of this real, and the matems as the failure of the mathematization where the real is exposed. Consequently, Badiou asserts that we are justified in saying that the matem is what inscribes the real as an impasse. This is the real of what can be thought of the real. For the time being, let's just make do with this formula that uses the phrase I'm suggesting, the real of the real. Expanding on this line of thought, Badiou argues that in Lacan's view, the unsayable truth of the world, about which Wittgenstein insists that one must be silent, is indeed that real of the real that cannot be spoken about, but only written. Such is precisely the matem in Lacan's psychoanalysis. For Lacan, in what is absent as real, there is what can be thought of this real. There is science. Then, of what can be thought of this real, there is what is at the real point of its impasse, what I call the real of the real. And at that point, there is not, strictly speaking, what can be thought. Rather, there is what can be transmitted, which is not the same thing. We could say that behind mathematization, there remains a non-writable remainder as an inconsistent multiplicity that cannot be counted as one, cannot be transformed into a set, an ungraspable residue that, according to Badiou, opens up the very horizon of mathematicity, the very horizon of thought. It is due to its non-transformability into a set that the inconsistency appears as void, which is the name of being according to a situation. Badiou contends that at the beginning of thinking, there is an affirmative decision to stitch to the void, to the empty set, which allows for thinking without being limited by the one. Therefore, he emphasizes the necessity of axiomatization to enable the delivering of the multiple, to bringing it into the existence without implying the being of the one. However, in contrast to axiomatization, language, whether formal or verbal, does not create new multiplicities, but rather separates a given already existing multiplicity from inconsistent multiplicities, counting it as one. As he points out, language cannot induce existence, solely a split within existence. And it is within this split that the inherent equivocity of language comes to the force. This elucidates why Badiou vehemently opposes interpretations of Lacan's psychoanalysis that highlight the ambiguity and equivocity inherent in language. Language merely counts and names. Language merely counts and names an already existing multiplicity. Axiomatization brings forth the multiple into existence. In contrast to Barbara Cassin's perspective, which suggests that psychoanalysis, particularly in Lacan's work, plays on the ambiguity of the signifier to challenge fundamental philosophical notions, especially the university of being, Badiou accentuates the concept of formulas, which offers a counter-argument to views that emphasizes the inherent equivocity of language. A formula like that of abstract sense, for him, is a statement of unequivocal clarity. This implies that if we consider Aristotle's metaphysic as the author of Lacanian psychoanalysis, it must be acknowledged not because Aristotelian metaphysic advocates the university of being, but because Aristotle failed to grasp that the safeguarding of university can be entrusted to mathematical literality, the paradigm of every hole punched by truth in the inadequacy of meaning, sense, and the discursive real of ontology of the multiple. He immediately adds that it is only through the test of formalization that sense, touched by the real, brings about truth as absence. In Badiou's reading of Latourdi, formalization is introduced as the aim of psychoanalysis, providing an order of symbolization in which there is no longer any trace of ambiguity. Thus, the question of transition from linguistic ambiguity to formalization as a boundary and negation of ambiguity is the fundamental question on which Badiou asserts Latourdi is focused. To put it differently, Badiou takes the goal of psychoanalysis as that of writing the unconscious in formulas without any remainder left behind, which is, in his view, Lacan's main concern during the 1970s. In contrast to Badiou's emphasis on the importance of the method in psychoanalysis for rearranging the truth, knowledge, real triad, and ensuring the integral transmissibility of knowledge, Cassin's reading of Lacan's text highlight Laurent and its jouissance, emphasizing language's capacity for homonymy and the inherent ambiguity, equivocation within it. She engaged with Latourdi as an anti-Aristotelian, or more precisely, ab-Aristotelian text, asserting that what is at stake is nothing less than changing the principle of all principles, switching from the principle there is no such thing as contradiction, referring to Aristotle's principle of non-contradiction, to the principle there is no such thing as sexual relationship. It is the discursivity of this new principle, there is no such thing as a sexual relationship, that Létourdi puts into play. Therefore, the deployment of psychoanalysis and philosophy on the battlefield of language can be described as follows. In the realm of philosophy, represented by Aristotle, the sense of a word encapsulates the essence of the thing, resulting in a singular interpretation. A man is unequivocally a man. Conversely, in Lacanian psychoanalysis, the only sense, the unsense, is unsense, characterized by the deprived of sense. This implies that there is no sense other than equivocation, and this is called absence, an escape from the Aristotelian norm of sense, a norm that is moreover constitutive of the perennial regulation of language, such that it constantly returns, no more or less so than does the unconscious. By connecting the return of the absence and the return of the unconscious, Cassin aligns psychoanalysis and sophistry on this battlefield, opposing philosophy's emphasis on sense. On one side, Aristotle and ontology represent the regulation of language. On the other, Lacan and psychoanalysis embodied absent-mindedness. On one side, there is no such thing as contradiction. On the other, there is no such thing as sexual relationship. On one hand, university and the equation of sense and essence. On the other, homonymy, equivocation, and absence. The unconscious returns due to the intervention of its language, la langue. Lacan maintains that the act of saying dire, the interpretation, only proceeds from the fact that the unconscious, insofar as it is structured like a language, namely la langue, that the langue that it inhabits is subject to the equivocation by which each language is distinguished. Similarly, in a quote from La Troisième, 1974, Lacan emphasizes that it is through la langue that interpretation operates, which does not prevent the unconscious from being structured like a language. Furthermore, in his Geneva lecture on the symptom, 1975, Lacan points out that, quote, it is absolutely certain that it is in the way in which la langue has been spoken and also heard as such in its particularity, that something will subsequently emerge in dreams, in all sorts of mistakes, in all manners of saying. What I mean is that here there resides what it is that prevents anyone from finding another way of nourishing what just before I call the symptom. Soler regards this lecture as the main argument about the effects of la langue, emphasizing the link it makes between la langue and the symptom. Drawing upon Freud's method effectively interpreting symptoms, which involves a coalescence between the first encounters with the sexual and the subject's own associations, Soler observes that Lacan expands Freud's notion of the trauma of sex by introducing the trauma of la langue, indicating the traumatic encounter with language. This encounter precedes language acquisition and involves the impregnation of the subject by language before being able to actively engage with it and compose sentences. It is through the subject's experience of Lacan, both spoken and heard, that symptoms emerge in dreams, various stumblings, and all sorts of saying. Therefore, one could argue that this materiality, which is Lacan wordplay combining materiality and mot as word in French, therefore one could argue that this materiality of the unconscious accounts for the formation of symptoms. Jean-Claude Milner provides a similar argument by saying that Lacan gives homophonies to the subject. Homophonies quite often provide us with our first encounter with Lacan. Should we be surprised that children are spurred on by echoing repetitions, papa, mama, dada, something other than language as a faculty of speaking, or language as the order of say this, but don't say that, is at work here. In his reading of Lacan's mathematical formalization in Seminar 20, Mladen-Dollard argues that the formalization of the mathem should not be understood as a meta-language concerning ordinary language and Lacan. This is not only because we have to use language as a means and the framing of formalization, but more significantly because there is no meta-language in relation to the real. This applies to both Lacan and mathem. There is no meta-relation between the two because they both engage with the real instead of simply referring to it or attempting to articulate it as something external to them. The real is not an external dimension that they aim to define, but it emerges precisely within the paradoxes and impasses of their deployment. As we see, in contrast to Cassin and Badiou, Dollard contends that there is no choice between mathem and Lacan. Consequently, he suggests that the crucial aspect regarding relation between the two lies in the fact that, quote, formalization, in its effort to cure the impasses of language, itself runs into its own impasses. Both sides, in their seeming opposition, are rather held together by their shared impasses. That one should insist not simply on their co-belonging, but on their speculative unity, as it were. This is where the Hegelian infinite judgment is perhaps the conceptual device that needs to be put to its full use. That the voice, babbling, relation, Lacan can ultimately be epitomized by the letter of the mathem, and that the letter in its seeming fixity equals the vacillation and fleetingness of the voice. Okay, just let me jump into the last part. Okay. Miller elucidates why Lacan himself, instead of making a choice between Lacan and mathem, insists on the relation between the two. The homophonies are the mathem par excellence. They are the means of its transmissibility. They incarnate the violence and efficacy of literality more purely than Bourbak's letters do. La langue is not just a milieu in which what is heard is reflected in what is said. It has become active. One can draw a force from it that is able to open points of passage for sense. In Le Troisième, Lacan explicitly emphasizes this relation by stating that there is no letter without some la langue. That is, in fact, the problem. How can la langue be precipitated into the letter? Is not Lacan's Joycean term one of the last endeavor to address this question, moving from the matem to Borromean not as writing of the real, and making a clear distinction between signifier and letter? In his Joycean term, Lacan makes homophonies that go beyond those that la langue offers directly, or that can be obtained by simple operations. They are not given by language. They are constructed homophonies. A few months before Le Tourdi, in his Milan lecture, Lacan introduces the cleverest capitalist discourse. A discourse in which the position of truth is occupied by swan, and the signifierization of surplus jouissance hinges upon the disavowal of the lack. Within such a discourse, there is only given la langue, which is signifierized, valorized, circulated, consumed, exploited by the proliferation of S1s. One could say that in the face of such a discourse, Lacan attempts to move from signifier to signifier as a written letter, which takes place when, according to Dominic Holmes, one signifier coincides with the subject, not as a positive trait, but as the stitch that indicates that some operation was needed to sew the subject into the order of signifiers. This can be qualified as the real of the subject, not some terrifying bodily jouissance one needs to find defenses against, but the necessity of a writing, a weaving together of three rings into a consistent knot. From the signifier to letter, from the matem to the knot, from the given la langue to the constructed la langue, Lacan keeps going, writing the real. But
And the
psychoanalysis still is the clinic of the real. Thank you.